The rain started before the committal and did not stop. The priest had found me twice already with his eyes, once at the door when the mourners filed in, once at the lectern when he should have been reading, and by the time we were standing in the churchyard mud with the casket suspended over the ground, I had catalogued it as something to come back to. Gerald stood across the grave from me with his hand on a colleague's arm, and his face composed into the specific expression of a man receiving grief in measured installments. I had watched him perform for 30 years. I knew the tells, the slightly exaggerated blink, the way he timed his exhale to coincide with the priest's pauses, as though air itself were a kind of tribute. He was good at it. He had always been good at it. Father Daniel Corrigan was 80 or close to it, with hands that shook when they weren't occupied. After the burial, he found me at the tree line, away from the other mourners, which told me he had been watching long enough to know where I would go. He pressed an envelope into my hand. The wax seal was old, the impression a simple cross. He said, Cedar Falls Storage, Industrial District east of the river. Unit 11, your mother prepared it. Go tonight, go alone. His eyes moved once to Gerald across the churchyard, and then back to me, and that single movement told me more than anything else he could have said. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. Gerald, come straight home. We should be together tonight. Don't talk to anyone at the church. I stood in the rain and looked at the envelope. I drove east. Cedar Falls Storage was corrugated metal and a flickering fluorescent that made the locks hard to read in the dark. Unit 11 opened on the first try. A key had been taped inside the envelope, along with a folded note I saved for last. The unit smelled of dry paper and something faintly chemical, the smell of things preserved against time. A duffel bag, a document box, a framed photograph wrapped in brown paper and sealed with tape. I opened the photograph first because I am a journalist, and I understand that physical evidence has a sequence, and that sequence matters, and because I already knew, in the way you know things before the confirmation arrives, that whatever was in the frame was going to change the order of everything. The man in the photograph had my jaw. He had the angle of my eyes and the particular set of my shoulders and the way his hands rested in his lap, angled slightly inward. A habit I had spent 34 years attributing to no one. His name was Thomas Elias Hartwell. The birth certificate was certified, stamped, and dated 8 months before my mother's marriage to Gerald. His name was in the father's field. Gerald's name was not in the document box at all, except in the places where it shouldn't have been. The document box contained correspondence between my mother and a woman named Petra Johnson, beginning 19 years ago and ending 14 months before my mother's death. Thomas Hartwell's will, executed 3 decades prior, nomming a daughter as primary heir. An estate assessed above $4 million. A death certificate. Thomas Elias Hartwell, accidental drowning, Lake Junaluska, 1991. Deed transfer documents for a waterfront parcel I had never heard of. And at the bottom, in my mother's handwriting on a single piece of notepaper, Gerald knows, he arranged it. The accident was not an accident. Find Petra Johnson. She was there, she saw everything, she's been waiting. I sat on the concrete floor of Unit 11 for 11 minutes. I know the time because I checked. The way I check elapsed time during any interview or briefing where the stakes are high enough that duration becomes a form of information. 11 minutes and then I stood up, loaded the document box and the duffel into my car, and drove to Martin's. Martin Weber had made his career in places where facts needed to be extracted from environments that did not want them extracted, and had transitioned, after 12 years of that, into a private research operation that served the people he trusted and declined everyone else. He made coffee without asking whether I wanted it, and listened without interrupting, while I laid the documents across his kitchen table in the order I had assessed them. Gerald called twice. The voicemail from the first call said he was worried. The voicemail from the second said my mother had not been well in her final weeks, that she had said things that weren't grounded, that he only wanted to make sure I was all right. Martin and I looked at each other across the table. I said, he's already building the competency narrative. Martin said, how long do you need? I said, a week, maybe less. He refilled his own coffee. He said, "Tell me about Petra Johnson." I spent the following morning at the public records terminal at the county courthouse. Thomas Hartwell had been in a documented land dispute over a waterfront parcel on the Swannanoa, a development site with commercial zoning that had been the subject of contested filings for 18 months before his death. The opposing party in the earliest filings had been redacted in the public record, which is not standard and requires a specific petition to execute. The petition number matched a filing handled by a newly licensed attorney named Gerald R. Page. Martin located Petra Johnson in Saluda by afternoon. She picked up on the second ring. She said, "I've been expecting this call for a long time." Saluda is 40 minutes south on a state highway that narrows into gravel before it becomes her road. Her house was white clapboard, tidy, a garden that had been put to bed for the season. She had tea ready when I arrived. She had been Thomas Hartwell's close friend the year he died. Not a romantic relationship. She was clear about that. But the kind of friendship that forms between people who understand each other's way of working. And Thomas had been meticulous, thorough, the kind of engineer who kept records not from bureaucratic instinct, but because he believed that documented reality was harder to revise than memory. She had noticed the irregularities before he did. Deed transfers that didn't match the public filings. Unsigned documents that appeared in subsequent chains of title as though they had been signed. Money moving through an account registered to a newly incorporated LLC with no operating history. She had mentioned it to Thomas in June. He had begun pulling the thread himself. The man pulling from the other end was Gerald. She was on the lake with Thomas the day he drowned. They had gone out in a canoe, a habit of theirs, a Sunday ritual, and she had been 50 yards from him when a second boat came around the headland. She described it, a rental motorboat, moving without urgency, no identifying markings she could hold. A single figure at the helm whose face she could not see from that distance. She watched the boat come alongside Thomas. She watched the water. She went to the police 4 days later. The detective who took her statement was thorough for 20 minutes and dismissive for the final 5. He asked whether she had consumed alcohol on the lake. He asked about her relationship with the deceased. He thanked her for coming in. 2 weeks after that, her apartment was searched. Nothing was taken. Everything was moved. She understood the message and she left, drove to Saluda and stayed because it was her cousin's town and because obscurity had its uses. She had contacted my mother once, years later. My mother had already known by then, or had known enough to know she did not want to know more. She was afraid, she told Petra. Alina was small. She was managing what she could manage and hoped that one day she would find a way to make sure Alina knew. Petra looked at me across the kitchen table. She said, she ran out of time. I asked whether she would testify. She said, I've been ready for 19 years. I drove back to Asheville and called Lillian Cole from the highway. Lillian was a forensic estate attorney who had dismantled 4 fraudulent probate arrangements in 8 years and who described her own practice as corrective surgery without the anesthetic. I read her the estate documents over the phone. She was quiet for a long time. She said, the original Hartwell estate was never legally dissolved. The transfers are void going back to the initiating fraud. The waterfront parcel alone, given current zoning and development values, she paused, was doing mental arithmetic, is north of 6 million. I said, can you file Thursday? She said, I can file Thursday at 9. Gerald sent an associate to find me the following morning. I was at a cafe on Lexington when he walked in, young, suited, carrying a specific kind of composure that belongs to people who have been briefed rather than prepared. He sat down across from me and told me, with careful imprecision, that documents prepared during a period of diminished cognitive function could be subject to challenge, and that my mother's state of mind in her final weeks had been a source of concern to Gerald and to the family's legal team. I let him finish. Then I told him, I have a certified birth certificate, an executed will, and a chain of fraudulent title transfers documented across 30 years of public filings. I have a sworn eyewitness who was present the day Thomas Hartwell drowned and who has identified a second vessel. I have a forensic estate attorney who reviewed the filings last night and confirmed that the original estate was never legally closed. I have a retired detective whose ruling I will be discussing with him shortly." He said nothing. I said, "Tell Gerald I said thank you. Scared men make mistakes. This conversation is one of them." He left without touching his coffee. Martin had found 2 additional sources by Wednesday morning. A former clerk from Gerald's firm who had left under circumstances she had declined to specify publicly for 6 years and was now willing to specify. And a retired detective named Carl Howes who had worked the Thomas Hartwell drowning in 1991 and who, it turned out, had been visited personally by Gerald Page 3 days before signing the official ruling. I called Carl Howes from my car. He picked up on the first ring. He sounded like a man who had been waiting for someone to call. He said, "I've been sitting on this for 30 years. I need you to understand that doesn't make it right. I understood what I was doing. He paused. I understood what he was capable of. What he had on me was nothing serious. It didn't need to be serious. That was the point." I said, "Will you go on record?" He said, "Yes." The article was 14,000 words. I wrote it in 31 hours with the documents open across 3 screens and Lillian on call for sourcing questions. My editor, who had run 3 of my previous investigations and understood that my requests for front-page space were not negotiable when I made them this way, read it at midnight and called me at 12:40. He said, "This is the cleanest sourcing I've seen on a case this complex." I said, "Lillian files at 9. I need it live at 6. He said, 6:03. Copy desk needs 3 minutes. I said, "Fine." On Wednesday evening, I drove to Gerald's house in Kenilworth. I want to be precise about why. Not to warn him, not to negotiate terms, not to give him the opportunity to do anything differently than he was going to do. I had built cases against men like Gerald before, men whose power rests on the assumption that the people they have wronged will remain either ignorant or afraid. And I had learned that there is a specific moment, before the reckoning becomes public, when they need to understand that the ignorance and the fear are already gone. It is not for them. It is for you. He answered the door in his weekend clothes, and his face did the thing it did when his composure met information it hadn't been prepared for: a brief arrest, a resetting. He looked at me and seemed to understand that whatever this was, it was not a grieving daughter come home. I stood on his front step. I told him without raising my voice exactly what I held: the birth certificate, the will, the deed transfers, the eyewitness, the retired detective, the forensic attorney, the article. I told him the article would publish at 6 in the morning. I told him the estate claim would land in probate court at 9. I told him the state attorney's office would receive a criminal referral before noon. He said my name once, in the tone he had used my entire life to indicate that I was approaching a line I should not cross. I turned and walked back to my car. Behind me, from inside the house, the sound of something breaking, a glass, a lamp, something ceramic, and then silence. I drove home and slept for 5 hours and woke before the alarm. The article published at 6:03. By 8, it had been read and shared by enough people in enough relevant positions that the shape of the day was already determined. Gerald's firm released a statement at 11, calling the reporting defamatory. The statement was deleted at 3 in the afternoon when it became clear that the 23 sourced documents attached to the article were not the work of a confused woman in her final weeks. They were 30 years of paper, cross-referenced and clean. The estate claim landed in probate at 9, as Lillian had promised. A criminal referral went to the state attorney before lunch. The referral, Lillian noted, was not something she had arranged. Someone at the courthouse had made it independently. The junior associate, who had come to my cafe table, resigned at noon. I noted this without satisfaction. He had been doing what he was told by a man who had done worse. The gradation matters even when the structure doesn't excuse it. Carl House gave a statement on his front lawn at 2 in the afternoon. He stood without notes. He said he had made a mistake, that a man of considerable influence had spoken to him before his ruling, that he had understood the implications and made the choice he made, and that he was sorry it had taken this long for the truth to have the room it needed. His voice was even throughout. He was not performing contrition. He was a man settling a debt he had carried for 30 years, and he knew the weight of it, and he paid it plainly. Gerald was arrested at his office at 4:40. Fraud and obstruction of justice, initial charges, with a separate inquiry opened into the circumstances of Thomas Elias Hartwell's death in the summer of 1991. I watched the footage on my phone in the parking lot of the cafe on Lexington, where 9 days earlier a young man in a suit had told me my mother had not been of sound mind. The footage was 30 seconds long. Gerald walked out of his office building with 2 officers, and one hand raised slightly, the gesture of a man who is still managing how he is being seen, still calculating the optics of a moment that has moved entirely beyond optics. I felt no particular elation. What I felt was something I had felt at the close of the 3 previous investigations that had resulted in indictments. A settling, like a debt finally entered into the correct column of the correct ledger. The world had not changed. An account had been corrected. Martin called at 5. I said, "It's done." He said, "How does it feel?" I said, "Strange. Like I've been carrying something heavy for a long time, and now my hands don't know what to do." He said, "Give them something to do." I sat in the parking lot for a while after we hung up. The late afternoon light was doing the thing it does in November in the mountains, going gold and then going fast. I thought about Thomas Hartwell, the photograph, the jaw I had inherited, the hands he held the way I held mine. I thought about my mother's note, the handwriting I had known my whole life applied to sentences she had never been able to say aloud. I thought about Petra Johnson at her kitchen table in Saluda, 19 years of deliberate quiet, ready when the call came. I had been Alina Page my entire life. The name had never felt entirely like mine. I had attributed that to the ordinary alienation of adulthood, the slow divergence between who you become and what you were called before you became it. Now I understood it differently. I would use the name Hartwell. I did not make a production of this decision. I noted it and it held, and I moved on. I called Petra. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "It's over. He was arrested this afternoon. The estate claim is filed. The inquiry into Thomas is open." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother would have," and stopped. I said, "I know." I said, "I'm coming to Saluda. You deserve to hear all of it in person. Everything that happened in order from the beginning. You've been part of this story for a long time, and you should have the whole account." She said, "I'll have tea ready." I got on the highway heading south. The mountains held the last of the light on their upper ridges, and the valley was already dark, and the road ran straight between them, wide and unhurried. There was no one behind me and no particular reason to go faster than I was going. I thought about what Martin had said, "Give your hands something to do." I drove south. The road ahead was entirely mine.